Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 18th of August, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and I'm joined down in Melbourne by my friend Natalie Yoannidis. How are you today, Nat?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Pete. Of course, we're still locked down here. I feel like every time I talk to you, we're still in lockdown, but we're slowly getting there, hopefully starting to pick up soon.
Well, you do a fantastic job on the show, and we love having you come on and go through five of the biggest stories making waves in Australian sport every weekday morning. So that's what we're going to do this morning, and we are going to start down in Victoria with the AFL and a great yarn by Courtney Walsh in the Australian today, looking at the Geelong Football Club and their clinical dismantling of the top place Port Adelaide on Friday night. He's got some quotes from Jimmy Bartell on RSN radio yesterday, where Bartell's essentially saying he believes that Geelong is the complete package and that they absolutely can win the Premiership this year. He believes they're the best balanced side. With other sides in the top eight, Bartell says maybe if they get to a big final, there might be a forward missing or a defender, maybe some outside run. I think maybe the Cats are the most complete. Geelong, we don't necessarily love going about odds and gambling, but just really quickly on that, Geelong have shortened from $15 to win the Premiership a fortnight ago to now be the second favourites at $6 behind the West Coast Eagles at $4.50. In general, Nat, where do you see Geelong and how many teams do you think are actually in the race to win the Premiership this year, and who are they?
You know what? A couple of weeks ago, I would have said Geelong are no chance of winning the Premiership purely because they have that really awful history when it comes to finals. Recently, of course, they have won premierships in recent times, but in the last 5 years or so, they seem to get themselves into a great position, get into the top two, and then just really fall at the last hurdle when it comes to those big matches, when it comes to finals. I think that what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, though, particularly with the likes of Tom Hawkins being a real focal point for them up forward, and Gary Rowan also jumping up and really playing a supporting role in that way as a smaller forward. Geelong certainly have a great opportunity as well as things are going. They're up in Queensland at the moment. They're up in the hub, but all the families are up there at the moment as well. So that's certainly going to make things a little bit easier when it comes to the idea of homesickness. Gary Ablett's going to be coming back into the side very soon as well. So that's going to add another string to their bow. So I think that Geelong certainly have to be considered grand final contenders, premiership contenders. Overall, Pete, I reckon there's 5 teams that can still win it. I think you can't discount Port Adelaide or Brisbane, despite the fact that they've been a little bit out of form over the last couple of weeks. Port have been the best team in the competition throughout the season so far. They beat Richmond a couple of weeks ago. Charlie Dixon's been brilliant for them. Yes, there's a couple of questions about whether or not they have a tall defender that can take somebody like Tom Hawkins, as we saw the other day, but I think that they're still in the running. And then, of course, West Coast and Richmond are the other 2 teams that I think are certainly going to be premiership contenders when we do eventually get to the pointy end of this season.
Yeah, Richmond showing last night that it doesn't have to be pretty. You just need to get the job done in that narrow win over the Gold Coast. Someone else who's impressed me, by the way, down at Geelong is Cameron Guthrie. I love the way that he can play the unselfish tagging style game if necessary, and Chris Scott is happy to deploy him in that role, but he also has the ability to really hurt offensively as well. Our second story, and we're going to stay with the AFL, and we're going to stay on that grand final theme, and it's the conversation about where the AFL Grand Final should be held in 2020. Story from Lauren Wood in the Herald Sun today, where Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk has called on Victorians to rally behind Queensland as the destination of choice for the AFL Grand Final. We know the league's set to make a call by the end of this month. The chances of the MCG hosting the game, they're deemed incredibly slim, which is really sad for football purists and people who have attended grand finals at the MCG. It's the most fantastic sporting event in Australia, but at the same time, potentially an opportunity for Queensland. We know New South Wales, South Australia and Perth have also expressed a desire to host the game. Where do you think, from the perspective of a Victorian down there who will unfortunately likely lose the game, Nat, where do you think Victorian people and yourself would like to see it played?
Well, you're right, Pete. There's no way that this grand final is going to be played in Victoria. And if it is, I think that's going to be a real shame for the fans and for the players, because there's going to be nobody at that game the way that restrictions are going, the way that lockdown's been going here. There wouldn't be any fans at the MCG. And I think that that is going to be the big factor that decides exactly where this grand final is played. Personally, I'd like to see it played in Queensland. They have been so accommodating to the AFL throughout this season. They let all the teams in despite all the restrictions, despite the border closures, when other states wouldn't let us in. Remember, WA at the start of the season refused to let teams in without quarantining. So, of course, the Western Australian sides had to play the first 5 or 6 rounds of the season in Queensland. So they haven't been as accommodating, but I think what's going to determine exactly where this game is played is how many people they do allow to have. Let's assume it would be played at the Gabba, how full the Gabba would be and how many fans you're allowed to have at the Gabba. If they can have a similar number to what they would have at Optus Stadium over in Perth, then I think that the AFL should certainly be giving this game to the Queensland people. And it's a great opportunity to grow the game as well. Of course, it's not a real stronghold for the AFL in Queensland, whereas Perth people are already on board. It's the one sport that they live and breathe. So this is a great opportunity for the AFL to move into another market.
Our third story today, Nat, we turn to rugby union now, and a story from Wayne Smith in The Australian. Rugby Australia has released details yesterday of the Super 8 competition it's signed off on with its Sanzar partners, and which it's included in its show bag to broadcasters. With that tournament to be sold off each year to the highest bidding time zone friendly city in the Australasian region. Option 1 that they've put forward envisages a 4-week 13-match competition in which 8 sides made up of the leading 2 Super Rugby teams from Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, along with the team from Japan and South America, would be divided into 2 pools, play each other in a pool stage before the 2 winners come together for a final. Option 2, a 3-week 7-match alternative. Sides would be seeded 1 to 8, and it would be a knockout stage, quarterfinals, semi-finals, final, played over 3 weekends. Essentially, under both competition models, the entirety of the Super 8 competition would be played in one city, in one hub. It's a new outlook, it's a fresh outlook, and it's designed to accompany either a domestic Australian Super Rugby competition or a Trans-Tasman competition, which would run prior to that. It's a Champions League style. As someone who's worked really closely in the game, Nat, do you think it brings some new energy and excitement to what rugby fans can consume?
Yeah, I love it, Pete. I think that it's a great idea, regardless of which of those 2 models they do go with. Assuming we do have a domestic competition or a Trans-Tasman competition before that, I think it's an excellent idea to have a Champions League style finals series. It gives all these teams something else to aim for, to really strive towards, and keeps your Sansa partners happy as well. So I think that this is something that a lot of people could really get excited about. Australian sides still getting the opportunity to really test themselves against the South Africans, who play a very, very different style to what we're used to here in Australia and, of course, in New Zealand as well. So I think that this is something that Australian rugby fans could certainly be getting around.
And in terms of having different cities within the region bidding for the right to have that Super 8 competition in any given year, whether that ends up being in a Japan or whether it ends up, somewhere like Perth gets involved and brings everybody over there. Do you like that element of it as well?
Yeah, I love it. I think that it really brings the uncertainty. Of course, we have this with World Cups every 4 years where everyone congregates in one country and then we just have one host. It takes the travel element out of it. Don't have to worry about flying over to Argentina one week and then flying over to Johannesburg the next week. That gets eliminated. So that's certainly going to benefit teams that are traveling. I like it. I think that it's going to bring something that rugby really needs, not just in this country, but in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment. It's not quite the whole Six Nations idea that we had going, which could still happen. Of course, there's still potential for that, the Rugby Championship to grow, which I think is something that certainly needs to be looked at as well. But this adds another element to what is a pretty tired competition at the moment. Let's face it, we can't go forward with South Africa being involved in a Super Rugby competition anymore. But this certainly gives an opportunity to still play those South African teams and still add a lot of interest.
Yeah, and also you've got that added opportunity to potentially have a champion of the South taking on a champion from the North at the end of it, which would be pretty mouth-watering prospect as well. Our penultimate story today turns to rugby league. And after a couple of weeks on the couch, Wayne Bennett is back from his COVID suspension and will return to the coach's box this Saturday night when the Rabbitohs take on Manly. His side has strung together consecutive wins in his absence under the tutelage of his assistant coach, Jason Demetriou. But of course, we know Demetriou will take over as head coach in 2022 of the Rabbitohs with a succession plan already in place. Bennett extremely successful over the course of his career, but he is the oldest coach in the NRL. He's shown appalling lack of judgment in his actions that saw him stood down for that COVID breach and somehow manages to retain his position on Project Apollo, which is perhaps a story for another day. But what I want to ask you, Nat, we've seen Demetriou knock up 2 straight wins. With the succession plan already in place for 2022, is this perhaps an opportunity for the Rabbitohs and Wayne Bennett to part ways a year earlier, and he could, heaven forbid, go back to a role at the Broncos or the St George Illawarra Dragons?
Pete, my experience with succession plans usually suggests that egos get in the way when it comes to whether or not a coach is going to depart early. Usually it involves a senior coach who has a proven track record when it comes to finals, when it comes to really getting a team towards, playing really good football. So, of course, that's going to come into it. I would not expect Wayne Bennett to be happy with the idea of parting a year early. That's certainly not going to be something that would be crossing his mind. So the Rabbitohs have a really difficult decision to make. They'd also have to pay out his contract, which at the moment seems to be fine with NRL teams. Of course, we've seen 5 coaches depart so far this season, so that hasn't seemed to be a deterrent despite COVID and despite the financial restraints that some clubs find themselves under. My experience, again, with the succession plans is that as a general rule, they don't really work. Of course, we're watching what's going on with Essendon at the moment with the succession plan with John Worsfold and Ben Rutten. A lot of debate down here in Melbourne as to whether or not John Worsfold should be coaching out the rest of the season. Now, he knows he's going at the end of the season, and at the way Essendon are playing at the moment, they're not going to play finals. So there could only be 5 games left in his career, and he refuses to go. Wayne Bennett's probably going to be in exactly the same situation. Don't expect to see the Rabbitohs rushing him out the door, certainly not before the season ends.
Too many cooks spoil the broth is the old adage, which is perhaps particularly apt here. And to your point around John Worsfold as well, he's been kind of actively spruiking for some sort of role, potentially at the Fremantle Football Club when he returns to Western Australia next year as well, which doesn't necessarily rub me up the right way. Our final story this morning comes from Sam Phillips, friend of the show, and in fact, tomorrow's special guest. He's written in the Sydney Morning Herald today, and it's a fascinating article that takes an approach I haven't really considered previously. He's spoken with Tony Moore of the Alliance for Gambling Reform, which is Australia's chief anti-gambling body. And Tony Moore's called for both NRL teams and players to be given the right to withdraw themselves from use in same-game multi-bets, warning that sports codes are facilitating the online abuse of their players. We saw Melbourne Storm superstar Ryan Pappenhuisen say last week that death threats was part of the job for NRL players who are typically part of same-game multis. For example, Pappenhausen to score a try as part of a 6 or 7 leg multi, and if he doesn't do that, then people who've had that bet having a crack at him via social media channels. We saw Josh Bruce and Mitch Robinson in the AFL also speaking up about it, and 30 or 40 messages after most matches, from people telling them that they've stuffed their multi. In general, Nat, do you think players should have the opportunity to withdraw themselves from these types of betting markets?
I think that once you give players that kind of opportunity, I think you'll find that pretty much all of them are going to opt out, Pete, and I think that that's then going to really compromise the market. So I don't think that this is something that is going to be happening. If that was to occur, then you would pretty much have to start getting rid of all of those multi-bets that include something that's a little bit out there, that's not just your head-to-head or your margin. So I don't think that this is going to be something that happens. What needs to happen is that we really need to start addressing social media and the toxic nature of what does occur. Death threats are absolutely not on. People abuse people on social media. You know, your regular punter who can hide behind can hide behind a social media account, doesn't even have to put up a photo of themselves, can abuse people, and that's not on. That's where things really need to stop. That's what we need to start looking at, and not necessarily the gambling market, because like I said, if we do start to take away players from things like a first try scorer, how many tries have been scored, etc., then you're really going to compromise that market.
Question without notice for you, Nat, and we don't have too much longer, but as a public figure and a member of the media fraternity, we know a lot of journalists also cop a fair degree of unsavoury comments via social media. Is that something that you've experienced?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're constantly getting people with different opinions to what you have, attacking you on social media, having a go at what your own views are. It's a part of, unfortunately, it is a part of public life, but it is something that certainly needs to stop, because like I said, you can have these people hiding behind anonymous accounts and just saying whatever it is they like. It's an issue, of course, we've seen with North Melbourne as well recently. There was a pretty unsavoury comment about Aaron Hall and about his child on social media. It's a toxic nature, social media, unfortunately, particularly when it does come to sport, because people do get so passionate about it, and it's something that really needs to be addressed.
The irony being, of course, that social media can be a place where you can find so much good content, including the best on ground weekday kickoff. But yeah, there's so many great things that you can find online. It's a great way to be part of the conversation when you're following a game of sport, for example, or to interact with, the people who play for the teams that you love. So I agree wholeheartedly. There's plenty of work. It's a broader societal issue, and hopefully we see some setups put in place where athletes and players can continue to have that social media presence without necessarily feeling like every time they log on, they're going to face a barrage of abuse. Nat, that's all we've got time for today. Thanks as always for joining us on the Best on Ground Weekday Kickoff. Great to catch up, and look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pete.
And as I mentioned, tomorrow, Sam Phillips from the Sydney Morning Herald will be joining us. Look forward to chatting then. Cheers.